Woman returns from death with a disturbing message from Jesus. The steady beep of the heart monitor suddenly flatlined into a single piercing tone. Through the chaos erupting around my body, I found myself floating near the ceiling of Operating Room 7 at St. Michael's Hospital, watching as my own life hung by a thread below. She's coding. Starting chest compressions, Dr. Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos. Her hands moved rhythmically on my chest while other members of the trauma team rushed around my lifeless form. I wanted to tell them I was right here, watching everything unfold like a surreal movie. BP dropping. "We're losing her," someone shouted. Through the fluorescent lights and urgent movements, I could see my face ashen, lips slightly blue, eyes closed. The same face that just hours ago had been arguing with my 16-year-old son James about his therapy session. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dr. Lisa Thompson, the renowned psychiatrist who had built her career debunking near-death experiences and religious delusions, was now experiencing what appeared to be exactly that. If I could have laughed at the absurdity, I would have. Clear the defibrillator pads came down on my chest. My body arched upward, then fell limply back onto the table. No response. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. That's when I felt it, a gentle but insistent pull upward, away from the operating room, away from my body, away from everything I had ever known or believed in. As the medical team fought to restart my heart below, I began to move toward a bright, welcoming light that seemed to pulse with its own life force. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning of a journey that would shatter everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the power of faith. If this opening glimpse into Dr. Lisa Thompson's extraordinary journey between life and death has sparked your curiosity, join our community of seekers. Subscribe now to unlock the full story of how one woman's skepticism transformed into an unwavering testament of faith. Before that fateful day, my life had been a testament to rational thinking and scientific methodology. As one of Boston's most sought-after psychiatrists, I had built my reputation on dismantling what I considered religious delusions and supernatural experiences. My office on the 20th floor of the Medical Arts Building overlooked the city skyline, a daily reminder of how far I'd climbed from my humble beginnings in rural Massachusetts. My walls were adorned with degrees from Harvard Medical School and certificates from prestigious psychiatric institutions, but what drew the most attention was the wall of testimonials, patients who had overcome their religious experiences through my treatment. I specialized in what I called reality-based therapy, helping people understand that their spiritual encounters were merely manifestations of underlying psychological issues. James, my 16-year-old son, often sat in my office after school, his dark eyes watching as I worked. He was brilliant like me, but troubled in ways I couldn't or wouldn't understand. His journal entries, which I'd secretly read, spoke of a deep spiritual yearning that frustrated me. Despite my best efforts to guide him toward rational thinking, he clung to the idea of something greater than science could explain. My colleagues revered me for my published papers debunking near-death experiences and religious visions. Neurological manifestations of spiritual experiences, a scientific analysis, had become required reading in several medical schools. I took pride in helping patients see that their glimpses of heaven, encounters with deceased loved ones, or conversations with God were simply their minds creating comfort in times of stress. But beneath my professional success lay a growing emptiness. My marriage to Thomas, a cardiac surgeon, had become a mechanical arrangement of shared schedules and polite conversations. Our home in Brookline was picture perfect, but felt hollow. The more patients I cured of their spiritual beliefs, the more I noticed a pattern. They lost their delusions, but also their light, that spark of wonder that had made them unique. I particularly remembered Sarah Collins, a young mother who had experienced a profound religious vision after losing her child. I had systematically dismantled her experience, explaining it away with scientific terminology and brain chemistry. She left my care cured but empty, her eyes vacant where they had once shined with purpose. It didn't bother me then. I considered it the necessary price of facing reality. My days followed a precise routine: morning consultations, afternoon therapy sessions, evening lectures at medical conferences. I was known for my unshakable composure, my ability to remain detached and analytical in the face of patients' emotional turmoil. Feelings aren't facts, I would tell them, ignoring the growing unease in my own heart. The last patient I saw before everything changed was Michael Robertson, a former pastor struggling with what he called a crisis of faith. He sat in my office, tears streaming down his face, describing a powerful spiritual experience that had shaken his understanding of reality. I remembered feeling a flicker of something doubt, perhaps, as I began to explain away his encounter with my usual clinical precision. Little did I know that fate was about to force me to confront everything I had spent my career dismissing. The universe, it seemed, had a rather ironic way of challenging one's beliefs. The morning of October 15th began like any other. I stood at my kitchen counter, sipping black coffee from my Harvard Medical School mug, reviewing my patient files for the day. James slouched at the breakfast table, pushing his scrambled eggs around the plate, his dark hoodie pulled up despite the warmth of our heated home. "You're seeing Dr. Anderson today," I reminded him, not looking up from my files. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. When I finally glanced at him, I caught a glimpse of something in his eyes that should have alarmed me, a mixture of despair and resignation that no mother should miss. "I'm not going," he said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that made me pause. "You can't keep trying to fix me, Mom. I'm not one of your patients," his words stung, but I responded as I always did, with clinical detachment and rational arguments. The morning's first patient was Rebecca Martinez, a colleague's referral who claimed to have had visions of her deceased grandmother guiding her through life decisions. As she sat across from me, tears streaming down her face while describing her experiences, I felt an unusual discomfort. My chest tightened slightly, the first warning sign I chose to ignore. "Mrs. Martinez," I began my usual speech, "what you're experiencing is a common psychological response to grief. The brain creates these scenarios to a sharper pain," interrupted my words, but I pushed through. After all, I had 3 more patients and a lecture to deliver at the medical school. By early afternoon, the discomfort had grown more persistent. During my lunch break, I found myself in the bathroom, gripping the marble countertop, trying to steady my breathing. In the mirror, my reflection looked pale, but I attributed it to lack of sleep and stress. I had a reputation to maintain. Dr. Lisa Thompson didn't take sick days. The text from James came at 2:47 p.m. "I love you, Mom. I'm sorry I couldn't be what you wanted." I read it during a session, made a mental note to discuss his dramatic tendencies with Dr. Anderson, and continued explaining to my patient why their profound spiritual experience was merely a neurological misfire. At 3:15 p.m., while elaborating on the scientific implications of temporal lobe epilepsy to a group of medical students, the pain became unbearable. My left arm went numb, and the room began to spin. The last thing I heard was a young resident calling for help as I collapsed mid-sentence. In those final moments of consciousness, my thoughts weren't of my numerous accolades or scientific papers. Instead, I remembered James's words from breakfast, the look in his eyes, and the text message I had dismissed. As darkness crept in from the edges of my vision, I experienced something entirely foreign to my rational mind: fear. Not of death, but of the possibility that I had been wrong about everything. The irony wasn't lost on me. The great skeptic was about to embark on a journey that would challenge every belief she held dear. As my consciousness faded, I heard a voice, clear and distinct, unlike anything I had ever experienced in my years of studying the human mind. "It's time," it said, "to see what you've been denying all these years." The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, there was plenty of that, with monitors beeping and people shouting, but rather the silence of my own heartbeat. As a doctor, I knew exactly what was happening: ventricular fibrillation, cardiac arrest, clinical death. As a scientist, I understood the neurological explanations for what I was experiencing. But as a consciousness somehow separated from my body, hovering near the ceiling of my own lecture hall, I found all my carefully constructed theories crumbling. "Get a crash cart in here now." Dr. Marcus Chen, my colleague of 15 years, was performing chest compressions on my body. From my elevated vantage point, I could see everything with impossible clarity: the sweat beading on his forehead, the look of determination in his eyes, the way his wedding ring caught the fluorescent light with each compression. The medical students who had been taking notes moments earlier were pressed against the wall, their faces pale with shock. One of them, a young woman with red hair, was crying silently. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that this would make an excellent case study for her future practice, but of course I couldn't. I watched as my body was transferred onto a gurney, my blue silk blouse now cut open, electrodes placed on my chest. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, but I could see the tension in their movements. They knew me, had worked with me, had attended my lectures on the neuroscience of near-death experiences. Now I was becoming one of my own case studies. The journey to the emergency room was surreal. I floated alongside my body, passing through walls and ceilings as if they were mere projections. The laws of physics, which I had always held as absolute, seemed more like gentle suggestions. Part of my mind, the rational scientific part that had defined my career, was frantically trying to explain this as hypoxia-induced hallucination. But another part, one I had spent decades suppressing, knew this was something else entirely. In the ER, time seemed to flow differently. I watched as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, head of emergency medicine, called out orders. BP's dropping. We need to stabilize her before we can get her to the cath lab. The team moved with choreographed precision, but I could sense their growing concern. My body wasn't responding to treatment. Then I noticed something that made my scientific mind reel. I could hear their thoughts. Not all of them, not clearly, but fragments of internal dialogue. Dr. Mitchell was thinking about her own mother's heart attack last year. The nurse preparing the defibrillator was silently praying something I would have scoffed at just hours ago. Most disturbing of all, I could feel their emotions. The concern from my colleagues wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. I felt their fear, their determination, their hope. As someone who had prided herself on emotional detachment, this sudden empathic connection was overwhelming. The memory of James's text message flashed through my consciousness. Even in this state, I could feel the weight of those words, "I love you, Mom." I'm sorry I couldn't be what you wanted. Why hadn't I seen the pain behind them? Why had I been so focused on fixing him that I'd forgotten to simply love him? A new sensation began to build, a pulling, not physical, but somehow more real than anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't coming from any direction I could name, yet it was unmistakable. As the medical team continued their efforts below, I felt myself being drawn away from the emergency room, away from the familiar confines of St. Michael's Hospital. The last thing I heard was Dr. Mitchell's voice. We're losing her, but strangely, I no longer felt afraid. The pulling sensation grew stronger, and with it came a peace that defied all my medical training. I was moving toward something, or perhaps something was moving toward me. Just before the hospital scene faded completely, I caught a glimpse of my own face, peaceful despite the chaos surrounding it. The irony struck me once again. I, who had spent years explaining away near-death experiences, was about to have one of my own. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. The tunnel wasn't what I had expected. In all my years of studying near-death experiences, patients had described a warm, welcoming light at the end of a dark passage. What I encountered was entirely different, a swirling vortex of light and energy that seemed alive with consciousness. Colors I had no names for danced through the radiance, and information flooded my awareness in ways that transcended mere sight or sound. As I moved through this space, memories began to surface, but not in the linear fashion I was accustomed to. I experienced them fully, completely, from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The first memory hit me with devastating clarity. I was back in my office, dismissing a young mother's spiritual experience after the loss of her child. "Mrs. Anderson," I heard myself say, "what you're experiencing is simply your brain's way of coping with trauma. There's no actual evidence of an afterlife or that your daughter is watching over you." But now I felt her pain, her desperate need for comfort, and the cold clinical way I had stripped away her only source of peace. The memory brought with it a shame so profound it would have brought me to my knees if I still had a physical form. More memories followed in rapid succession. Each interaction where I had prioritized scientific rationality over human compassion played out in excruciating detail. I saw my patients' faces, felt their hope dimming as I systematically dismantled their beliefs. But most painfully, I saw James every moment I had failed him as a mother, every time I had treated his spiritual seeking as a symptom to be cured. The tunnel seemed to respond to my distress. The swirling energies shifted, showing me moments I had forgotten or dismissed small acts of kindness I had performed without thinking, times when my clinical expertise had genuinely helped someone in crisis. But even these moments were tinged with a bittersweet understanding of how much more I could have done if I had been open to something beyond my rigid materialistic worldview. Suddenly, the movement through the tunnel stopped. Before me hung a moment in time like a crystalline photograph. James, sitting in his room that morning, writing what I now realize was a suicide note. I could feel his despair, his loneliness, his certainty that he would never be able to meet my expectations. The impact of this vision was overwhelming, and I tried to scream, to turn away, to deny what I was seeing. "Your pain is acknowledged," a voice spoke, though it wasn't really a voice in any conventional sense. It was more like pure understanding flowing directly into my consciousness. "But there is more you need to see." The tunnel resumed its movement, but now it seemed to be taking me somewhere specific. The chaotic swirl of memories gave way to a more ordered progression, as if something or someone was carefully selecting what I needed to experience. Each memory built upon the last, creating a tapestry of understanding that both humbled and terrified me. I began to notice something else: threads of light connecting every moment, every decision, every interaction. I could see how my actions had rippled out to affect not just my immediate patients, but their families, their friends, creating waves of influence I had never considered. The magnitude of our interconnectedness was staggering. The tunnel's light began to intensify, and with it came a sense of approach. I was nearing something profound. My scientific mind struggled to categorize and analyze what was happening, but those mental frameworks seemed hopelessly inadequate now. Everything I had believed about consciousness, about reality itself, was being systematically challenged. Just when I thought I couldn't process anymore, the tunnel opened into something else entirely. The space before me defied description. It was as if reality itself had expanded to encompass dimensions I had never imagined could exist. And there, in that impossible space, I sensed a presence that would change everything I thought I knew about existence. His presence was unlike anything my scientific mind could comprehend. As I emerged from the tunnel into what seemed like an infinite expanse of light, Jesus stood before me not as the traditional artistic representations I had seen in churches, but as pure love and wisdom embodied in a form my consciousness could comprehend. "Lisa," he spoke, and my name carried the weight of every moment I had lived, every choice I had made. His voice resonated with a richness that made my years of skepticism seem like a child's stubborn denial of the obvious. "You have questioned much, sought proof for everything, yet missed the deepest truths written in your own heart." I wanted to speak, to defend my scientific approach to life, but in his presence, all my carefully constructed arguments felt hollow. Instead, tears that weren't physical yet felt more real than any I had ever shed began to flow. I was wrong was all I could manage. "Your pursuit of truth was never wrong, Lisa," he replied, his compassion overwhelming. "But truth is greater than what can be measured in your laboratories. I am the way, the truth, and the life." These words were not meant as a constraint, but as an invitation to a deeper understanding. Images began to form around us, my patients, their faces lined with pain, as I systematically dismantled their experiences of faith. Each scene was accompanied by Jesus' gentle commentary, not condemning but illuminating the deeper reality I had missed. When they spoke of feeling my presence, he explained, "You gave them diagnoses. When they found comfort in prayer, you prescribed medications. You sought to heal their minds while dismissing the existence of their souls." The scene shifted to show my colleagues at the hospital, many of them people of faith who had kept their beliefs private, knowing my reputation. I saw their silent prayers for patients, their moments of seeking divine guidance before difficult procedures. These were brilliant, rational people who had found a way to bridge the gap between science and faith, something I had declared impossible. "Behold," he said, gesturing to a new series of images, "the power of faith you denied." I watched in awe as scene after scene showed healing that went beyond medical explanation, terminal patients finding renewed strength, desperate situations transformed by hope, broken spirits made whole through belief. "Science describes the mechanics of my creation," he explained, "but it cannot replace the Creator." As I absorbed these revelations, Jesus' presence grew even more intense. Your gift for healing was never meant to be limited to the physical and psychological. You were given the ability to understand deeply, to see clearly, to help profoundly. But you built walls around your gift, confined it to what you could explain through your limited understanding. Then he showed me something that shook me to my core, the ripple effects of my influence. I saw how my teachings had spread through my students, creating a network of healthcare professionals who, like me, dismissed the spiritual experiences of their patients. The damage wasn't just personal, it was exponential. Yet, he continued, his voice filled with hope, even in your doubt, you served a purpose. Your questioning has led you here, to this moment of understanding. Seek and ye shall find, knock and the door shall be opened unto you. You have sought truth your entire life. Lisa, are you ready to receive it in its fullness? I felt myself trembling in his presence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was experiencing. How can I make this right? I asked, my scientific certainty replaced by a profound humility. The truth shall set you free, he quoted, and the words carried a power I had never understood before. But freedom comes with responsibility. Are you willing to bear witness to what you have seen here? To stand for truth even when it contradicts everything you once believed? Before I could respond, Jesus raised his hand, and the space around us transformed. There is something else you must see, he said, his voice now carrying a weight of sorrow that made my soul ache. Something that requires all the strength you have gained in this moment. I sensed we were approaching a revelation that would shake the very foundations of my being. The light around us dimmed slightly, as if preparing to show me something my newly awakened spirit would struggle to bear. The scene that materialized before us was my home. The timestamp in the corner read 3:23 p.m., less than an hour after my collapse. James sat at his desk, my last text message to him still unanswered on his phone. We'll discuss your attitude tonight. The cold, clinical tone of my message now felt like a knife in my heart. No, I whispered, suddenly understanding what I was about to witness. Please, no, but Jesus stood firm beside me, his presence both comforting and unyielding. This was something I needed to see. I watched as my son, my beautiful, sensitive boy, took out a leather-bound journal, the one I had dismissed, as his emotional crutch's hands trembled as he wrote the final entry. Through some divine comprehension, I could read every word as he wrote them. Mom, I know you'll analyze this, try to find the psychological reasons, the chemical imbalances, the rational explanations, but for once, please just listen. I've tried to live in your world where everything has to be proven in a lab, where feelings are just neurological responses, where God is a delusion. I can't do it anymore. I feel him, Mom, I always have. And living in denial of that truth is killing me slowly. James paused, wiping tears from his face. I tried to reach for him, to stop what I knew was coming, but my non-physical form could only observe. The next paragraph of his note shattered what remained of my clinical detachment. I love you, Mom. I know you thought you were helping me, protecting me from irrational beliefs, but in trying to save me from what you saw as delusion, you made me feel like something was wrong with me. Every time I felt God's presence, you called it anxiety. Every spiritual experience became a symptom to treat. I'm not sick, Mom. I'm just different from you. He speaks truth, Jesus said softly. Your son has always been sensitive to the spiritual realm, a gift you interpreted as weakness. I watched in helpless agony as James opened his desk drawer and removed a bottle of pills samples from my own medical bag, ironically meant to treat depression. The cruel irony of a psychiatrist's son choosing this method wasn't lost on me. The time shown here, Jesus explained gently, is synchronous with your cardiac arrest. At the moment your heart stopped in the lecture hall, James made his decision. Two souls, mother and son, both departing earthly life at the same moment. But something was happening in the scene before us. As James raised the pills to his lips, a soft light filled his room, different from the harsh fluorescent glare he usually studied under. He paused, the bottle trembling in his hand. What's happening? I asked, hardly daring to hope. Watch, Jesus replied. James lowered the pills, his eyes wide. Mom, he whispered. Somehow, in that crucial moment, he had sensed something. Later, he would tell others that he felt a presence, a love so profound it broke through his despair. I realized I was witnessing a miracle the moment my scientific skepticism died and the hospital had created a spiritual connection I had always denied was possible. The pills fell from his hand, scattering across the floor. James collapsed into his chair, sobbing not in despair now, but in relief. He reached for his phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. I need help, he managed to say. And I almost did something terrible. Please, I need help. Your son has been saved, Jesus said, not by medicine or science, but by the very thing you spent your career dismissing divine intervention. Your moment of crisis became his moment of salvation. The scene faded, leaving me overwhelmed with gratitude and shame. I almost lost him, I whispered. My blindness almost cost my son's life. Yet from this moment, both of you will find a new path, Jesus responded. But there is more you must see. Your journey of understanding is not complete. The space around us shifted again, and I found myself surrounded by faces, dozens of them, then hundreds, all of my former patients. But these weren't the calm, cured individuals who had left my practice. These were their true selves, their spirits laid bare, showing the impact of my treatment in stark spiritual terms. Sarah Collins stepped forward first, the young mother whose religious experience I had dismissed after her child's death. Now I could see the full weight of my intervention. After you convinced me my daughter's presence was a delusion, she said, her voice echoing with pain, I lost more than my faith. I lost my last connection to her. The scene shifted to show her life after our sessions, an empty house, bottles of sleeping pills, a soul drowning in despair without the comfort of believing her child watched over her. Behind her, Michael Robertson, the former pastor, emerged. You called it cognitive restructuring, he said, his eyes filled with a sadness that transcended earthly grief. But you restructured more than my thoughts. You broke something essential in my spirit. I witnessed the congregation he had once led with passion, now listening to his empty, mechanistic sermons, his words devoid of the divine fire that had once inspired hundreds. One by one, they stepped forward, patients I had helped, each showing me the true cost of my rational approach. A teenage girl who had experienced angelic visions, now numbed by medications, her artistic gifts suppressed along with her spiritual sight. A grieving widower whose comforting dreams of his wife I had labeled as wishful thinking, leaving him alone with his logic but bereft of solace. Behold the ripples of disbelief, Jesus said, his voice filled with sorrow but not condemnation. Each soul you touched carried your influence to others. A spiritual winter spread from your office, freezing the tender shoots of faith wherever your theories took root. The scenes multiplied, showing me the extended impact of my work. Medical students who had adopted my approach, now spreading the same spiritual blindness to their own patients. Colleagues who had cited my research, using it to dismiss countless other spiritual experiences. The damage wasn't limited to individuals, it had become systemic, academic, a respected methodology for stripping the divine from human experience. But watch carefully, Jesus instructed, for even in winter, seeds lie dormant, waiting for spring. The panorama of faces shifted, and I began to see something else, small acts of resistance against my teachings. Patients who had nodded politely in my office but continued to pray in secret. Medical students who had questioned my dismissal of spiritual experiences, sensing there was more to human consciousness than neurons and chemicals. Most surprisingly, I saw how some had actually been strengthened in their faith by opposing my views. Their spiritual experiences, rather than being destroyed by my skepticism, had become more profound through the challenge of defending them. Your doubts, Jesus explained, became the whetstones upon which their faith was sharpened. Then came the most difficult revelation. A series of images showed me the patients who had taken their own lives after I had stripped away their spiritual experiences. 5 souls who, without the comfort of their faith, had succumbed to despair. I saw their final moments, felt their hopelessness, witnessed their conviction that if even their glimpses of the divine had been false, then nothing held meaning. Each of these deaths rippled outward, Jesus said, his voice gentle but firm. Families shattered, communities wounded, faith weakened, not just in individuals, but in entire networks of souls. I wanted to turn away, to shield myself from these terrible truths, but I knew I had to bear witness. This was the real cost of my materialistic crusade, the true price of my intellectual arrogance. Yet, Jesus continued, even here, in what you might see as your greatest failures, redemption was at work. For each soul that departed in despair. Others were awakened to the importance of spiritual support. Their deaths became catalyst for change in how others approached the marriage of faith and medicine. The scene pulled back, showing me a broader perspective. I saw support groups forming, spiritual counseling programs being developed, a gradual recognition in the medical community that faith could coexist with science, that spiritual experiences deserved respect rather than reduction to mere brain chemistry. You see, Jesus said, "Even in your denial of me, you served a purpose." Sometimes the greatest awakening comes through the darkest night of doubt. Now, Jesus said, his presence growing even more luminous, let me show you what you could not see before the divine interventions you dismissed as coincidence. The space around us transformed into what appeared to be a vast cosmic tapestry, where threads of light connected seemingly random events in my life and the lives of my patients. Remember this moment, he asked, as a scene materialized before us. It was 3 years ago a day I had almost canceled all my appointments due to a mysterious migraine. You called it chance that you decided to stay, Jesus said, but watch what really happened. I saw myself walking into my office that morning, about to call my secretary to reschedule when something made me pause. Now, with divine sight, I could see what I'd missed, a subtle wave of spiritual energy that had eased my pain, just enough to keep me there. The reason became clear as I watched Amy Chen, a young resident, walk into my office later that day, clearly intending to end her life after her shift. Despite my dismissal of spiritual matters, something in our conversation had given her hope. I'd never known how close she'd been to suicide. Your presence that day saved her life, Jesus explained. Not through your skepticism, but through my love working even through your doubt. She felt my presence in your office, though you would have denied its possibility. Scene after scene unfolded, showing me countless moments where divine grace had woven through my clinical practice. The time my car broke down, forcing me to reschedule a patient, which meant I was available when another patient had a crisis. The power outage that led to a deeply meaningful conversation by candlelight with a troubled teen. The wrong turn that made me late but put me in exactly the right place to prevent a tragedy. These were not random events, Jesus said, his voice filling me with understanding. Every moment was orchestrated, every coincidence was grace in action. Even as you denied my existence, I was working through you. The most powerful revelation came in the form of my own life's pattern. I watched as seemingly unrelated events aligned to bring me to this very moment, my choice of psychiatry, my focus on debunking spiritual experiences, even my rigid skepticism, all had been necessary to make my eventual transformation meaningful. Your doubt had purpose, Jesus explained, gesturing to a complex web of light that connected my life to countless others. Your questioning spirit, your demand for evidence, your rational mind, these were not obstacles to overcome, but tools being shaped for a greater purpose. I saw how my scientific training, which I had wielded like a weapon against faith, had actually been preparation for a deeper understanding. Every patient I had challenged, every spiritual experience I had analyzed, had given me insights that would now serve a different purpose. Look, he said, showing me future possibilities that branched out like golden threads. Your understanding of both the scientific and spiritual realms will bridge worlds that have been too long divided. Your story will reach those who, like you, have built walls between faith and reason. The visions showed me speaking to medical conferences, but now with a radically different message. I saw myself counseling patients with a new approach that honored both their spiritual experiences and their psychological needs. My research, once focused on debunking the divine, would now explore the harmony between science and faith. But this gift comes with great responsibility, Jesus said, his expression growing solemn. The path ahead will not be easy. Many will reject your transformation, just as you once rejected others' experiences. Are you prepared for what lies ahead? Before I could answer, the scene shifted one final time, showing me a hospital room, my hospital room, where my body lay in critical condition. Medical equipment beeped steadily, marking each precious moment between life and death. The choice is yours, Jesus said softly. You can remain here, in perfect understanding, or return to face the challenges of bridging two worlds. But know this, whatever you choose, my love goes with you. The moment of decision crystallized around me like a suspended breath. Jesus stood waiting, his presence both comforting and challenging, as I watched my earthly body through what felt like an infinite distance. The monitors beeped steadily, marking each moment between my two possible futures. If you choose to return, Jesus said, his voice resonating with both love and warning, you must understand that your life will never be the same. The path ahead holds both great purpose and great pain. Are you prepared for that? Before I could answer, he gestured, and scenes of my potential future unfolded before me. I saw myself waking up in the hospital, but something was different. My right side was paralyzed, a consequence of the prolonged cardiac arrest. Speech came with difficulty, words slurring and stumbling. The prestigious psychiatrist who had once commanded lecture halls would now struggle to form basic sentences. Your physical challenges will be the least of your burdens, Jesus continued, showing me more. I watched as colleagues backed away, their faces showing a mixture of pity and professional skepticism as I tried to explain my experience. My carefully built reputation crumbled as word spread about my religious conversion. Medical journals rejected my papers. Speaking engagements were canceled. Yet these trials will serve a greater purpose, he said, and the vision shifted. I saw myself learning to write with my left hand, painstakingly documenting my experience. A small group gathered around my hospital bed, former patients who had never lost their faith despite my attempts to dismantle it. They listened with tears in their eyes as I struggled to share my story. Then I saw James, my beautiful, sensitive son, sitting beside my hospital bed, holding my hand. I felt you, Mom, he said in the vision. That day when I was about to, I felt your love. And something more. Something bigger than both of us. The connection we would share, forged through our parallel experiences with the divine, would heal wounds I hadn't even known I was inflicting. Your suffering will become your testimony, Jesus explained. Your weakness will become your strength. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. The words resonated with a truth I had never understood before this moment. More visions flowed, a new type of therapy practice where I worked with both medical professionals and spiritual counselors. A book that bridged the gap between science and faith, written one painstaking word at a time with my left hand. A movement within the psychiatric community to recognize and respect spiritual experiences rather than dismissing them. But the choice must be yours, Jesus said. You can remain here in perfect understanding and peace, or return to face these challenges. Both paths serve my purpose. Both choices are made in love. I looked again at my physical body, seeing it now with new eyes. The limitations that awaited me, the paralysis, the speech difficulties, the professional ridicule, no longer seemed like punishments. They were opportunities, each challenge a chance to demonstrate the very truths I had spent my career denying. There will be moments, Jesus warned, when you will question this choice. Moments when the weight of your mission feels unbearable. What sustains you then must be more than memory, it must be faith. I thought of James, of my patients, of all the souls who needed to hear that science and faith could coexist. I thought of the medical students who would face their own struggles between empirical evidence and spiritual truth. My journey could help bridge that gap. I choose to return, I said, my non-physical voice resonating with certainty. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Because sometimes the truth has to be spoken by someone who once denied it. Jesus smiled. And in that smile, I saw infinite love and understanding. Then go, he said, and remember I am with you always, even unto the end of the age. The light around us began to shift, and I felt myself being drawn back toward my body. The last thing I heard was his voice, gentle yet powerful. Your greatest ministry will be born from your greatest skepticism. Fear not, for I have overcome the world. The return to my body felt like being pulled through layers of reality. Each layer brought new sensations, first awareness, then pain, then the overwhelming crush of physical existence. The mechanical beep of monitors slowly penetrated my consciousness, followed by the antiseptic smell of the ICU and the cold fluorescent lights above. She's responding, a voice called out, Dr. Sarah Mitchell's voice, though it sounded distant and distorted. Get Dr. Thompson in here. Her vitals are stabilizing. The irony wasn't lost on me. My husband, the cardiac surgeon, would be rushing to his wife's bedside, not as a doctor, but as a frightened spouse. Opening my eyes required immense effort. When I finally managed it, the faces above me were blurred, their expressions a mix of professional concern and personal relief. I tried to speak, to tell them about what I'd experienced, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. The right side of my face felt frozen, unresponsive. Lisa, don't try to talk, Thomas said, his hand gripping my left one. You've had a severe cardiac event. There may be some neurological deficits. We need to run tests. His voice was clinical, detached, the same tone I had used countless times with my own patients. Now, I understood how insufficient that approach was. I wanted to tell him about Jesus, about the visions, about James, but my throat constricted and my tongue felt like lead. Panic began to rise as I realized the extent of my impairment. The prestigious doctor. Lisa Thompson, known for her articulate lectures and sharp debates, could barely manage a grunt. The next few hours were a blur of tests, scans, and medical procedures. I drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening bringing sharper awareness of my new limitations. The stroke had affected my right side significantly, arm and leg paralyzed, speech center damaged. The prognosis, I could tell from my colleagues' carefully neutral expressions, was guarded. Then James arrived. My beautiful boy rushed into the room, his eyes red from crying, clutching something in his hands, his journal. "Mom," he sobbed, "I need to tell you something. Today when I almost." He couldn't finish, but he didn't need to. I knew. With tremendous effort, I managed to squeeze his hand with my left one. Tears rolled down my face. On the left side only, I noted with clinical detachment. James leaned closer, and in that moment, our eyes met with a new understanding. He saw something in my expression that made him pause. "Don't you," he whispered. "You were there somehow. I felt you unable to speak." I nodded slightly, the movement sending sharp pains through my neck. James's eyes widened. "There's more, isn't there? Something happened to you too." The doctors were concerned about my elevated heart rate and tried to usher James out, but I refused to let go of his hand. With immense concentration, I managed to form one word, Jesus. The effort left me exhausted, but the look of recognition on James's face made it worth it. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Mitchell interrupted, "you need to rest. The neurologist will be here soon to assess your condition." But I could see in her eyes something more than medical concern. She had heard my word, seen the connection between mother and son, and it disturbed her scientific worldview just as it once would have disturbed mine. As the medical team adjusted my medications and monitored my vitals, I drifted in and out of awareness, but each time I opened my eyes, James was there, reading from his journal. He shared his own spiritual experiences, the ones I had dismissed for so long. Now, unable to speak, I could finally listen. The day passed in this strange new reality where I, the former skeptic, lay mute but bursting with the most important message of my life. The irony was almost unbearable. At the moment I had the most profound truth to share, I had lost the ability to articulate it. Yet even in this frustration, I felt Jesus' presence, reminding me of his words, "My power is made perfect in weakness." Perhaps this inability to speak, to defend, to rationalize was exactly what I needed. For the first time in my life, I would have to let truth speak for itself. The next few weeks brought a cascade of losses that tested my newfound faith to its limits. The first came in the form of a letter from the hospital board delivered to my room by Thomas with clinical detachment. My medical license was being suspended pending a psychiatric evaluation. The official reason cited potential cognitive impairment, but the underlying message was clear. They feared their star psychiatrist had lost her mind. Thomas stood by my bed, his posture stiff and uncomfortable as I struggled to read the letter with my functioning left hand. "Lisa," he said, using the same tone he employed with difficult patients, "you have to understand how this looks. You're claiming religious visions. You're trying to communicate with gestures about Jesus and angels. This isn't you." I wanted to explain, to defend myself, but my speech remained frustratingly limited. Weeks of therapy had only restored a handful of slurred words. The best I could manage was real. It was real. Thomas's face tightened with what looked like pity mixed with embarrassment. "I'm moving out for a while," he announced, not meeting my eyes. "You need time to recover, to get back to yourself. James will stay with me. We think it's best. Given your condition," the words hit harder than my physical paralysis. Through my limited speech, I tried to protest, but Thomas had already made arrangements with his sister to provide my care. The next blow came from my colleagues. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had saved my life in the ER, visited with several other department heads. They spoke in careful, measured tones about stress-induced psychiatric symptoms and post-event confusion. When I managed to write a shaky note with my left hand about my experience, they exchanged worried glances. We're concerned, Dr. Mitchell said gently, that the cardiac event may have affected more than just your motor functions. These religious delusions, they're not uncommon after trauma, but they typically resolve with proper treatment. The irony of their using my own former arguments against me was not lost on me. My research papers were quietly withdrawn from pending publication. Speaking engagements were canceled. The textbook I had been writing on rational approaches to spiritual experiences was shelved indefinitely. My professional reputation, built over decades of rigorous scientific work, crumbled in a matter of weeks. Most painful was the distance growing between James and me. Though he had initially seemed to understand, Thomas's influence and the concerns of his therapist were taking their toll. During his increasingly rare visits, he sat awkwardly by my bed, no longer sharing from his journal, no longer talking about his own spiritual experiences. I could see him being pulled back into the rational, scientific worldview I had once championed. One afternoon, I found the strength to scrawl a question, "Do you still feel it?" James read the note, understanding I was asking about his spiritual experiences, about the divine presence he had felt the day of my cardiac arrest. He hesitated, then responded in a whisper, "Dad says it was just emotional stress. That we both experienced trauma-induced delusions." I watched, heartbroken, as my son retreated back into the cage of rationality I had spent years building around him. My inability to articulate what I had seen, what I now knew to be true, felt like a second death. Jesus' words echoed in my memory, "There will be moments when you question this choice." This was certainly one of them. Alone in my hospital room, facing the longest nights of my life, I began to understand suffering in a way my years of psychiatric practice had never taught me. My body, once a reliable instrument of my will, had become a prison. Each attempt at speech felt like fighting through quicksand. My right side remained stubbornly unresponsive, a constant reminder of my new limitations. The hospital chapel became my sanctuary, though getting there required a humbling journey in a wheelchair pushed by nurses who had once known me as the formidable Dr. Thompson. I spent hours there, my partially paralyzed body slumped in the first row, learning a new way to communicate, not through careful clinical analysis or eloquent lectures, but through silent prayer. Why this way, I would ask in my mind, struggling with the profound irony of my situation. The answer came not in words, but in a deep understanding my inability to speak was forcing me to listen. My physical weakness was teaching me to rely on strength beyond my own. Every limitation was, paradoxically, opening new pathways of understanding. I began keeping a journal, teaching myself to write with my left hand. The process was excruciatingly slow, my normally precise handwriting reduced to childlike scrawls. Each entry began with a quote from Jesus that I had heard during my experience, "My grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness." These words, which I had once would have dismissed as religious platitudes, now sustained me through the darkest hours. The hardest part was witnessing my own case being discussed by colleagues during their rounds. They spoke in hushed tones about conversion disorder, post-traumatic religious ideation, and stress-induced psychosis. I recognized their terminology. I had used it myself countless times to explain away patients' spiritual experiences. Now, lying in my bed, pretending to sleep, I heard the clinical detachment in their voices and understood how much I had missed in my own practice. One night, in the depths of despair, I experienced something that both challenged and confirmed my new understanding. As I struggled with the pain of my therapy exercises, feeling utterly alone and abandoned, the room filled with a familiar presence. No bright lights or dramatic visions this time, just a profound sense of peace and the unmistakable knowledge that I was not alone. My scientific mind immediately began generating explanations: endorphins, stress response, temporal lobe activity. But now I could see these mechanisms not as alternatives to divine presence, but as the very means through which it worked. My speech therapist, Amanda, became an unexpected ally. Unlike most of the staff, she didn't try to explain away my experience. During our sessions, as I struggled to form basic words, she shared her own journey of faith. Sometimes, she said, helping me with pronunciation exercises, God speaks loudest when we can't speak at all. The hospital psychologist mandated regular sessions, viewing my religious delusions as a primary concern. I sat through them, unable to effectively argue, watching him take notes with the same clinical detachment I had once shown. In my limited speech, I managed to ask him, "Have you ever considered Both he looked up, puzzled. I struggled to continue science. And Spirit, his uncomfortable shift in his chair reminded me of my own former reactions to such questions. Slowly, painfully, I began to find a new voice. Not the authoritative tone of Dr. Thompson, the skeptic, but something more humble and paradoxically more powerful. When words failed me, I learned to communicate through presence, through listening, through simply being with others in their pain. My weakness, as Jesus had promised, was becoming my strength. The first sign of change came from an unexpected source. Sarah Collins, the young mother whose spiritual experiences I had once dismissed, showed up at my hospital room one rainy Tuesday morning. She stood in the doorway, clutching a worn copy of my book, Debunking the Divine, a Scientific Approach to Religious Experience, her eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. Dr. Thompson, she said softly, I heard about your experience. She paused, watching me struggle to sit up with my functioning left side. The nurses told me you've been talking about Jesus, about seeing him. There was no judgment in her voice, only a gentle curiosity that brought tears to my eyes. Instead of speaking, I pointed to my journal with my left hand. Sarah hesitated, then picked it up and began to read. Her eyes widened as she went through my painfully scrawled accounts of the experience. When she looked up, her face was transformed. You understand now, don't you? What I was trying to tell you about feeling my daughter's presence. I managed to nod, and with tremendous effort, formed the words I was. Wrong. Sarah sat down beside my bed, took my paralyzed right hand in hers, and began to pray. The presence I had felt in my near-death experience filled the room, tangible and real. Word spread through the network of my former patients. They began to visit one by one, then in small groups. Each brought their own stories of spiritual encounters, the very experiences I had spent years trying to explain away. But now they came not to seek validation, but to offer it. Michael Robertson, the former pastor I had treated for religious delusions, arrived with his entire congregation. They filled my room and the hallway outside, singing hymns that brought the nurses running in alarm. Through my tears, I saw some of the medical staff stopping to listen, their clinical expressions softening. Most surprisingly, some of my former medical students began to come forward. Dr. Emily Chen, now a practicing psychiatrist herself, visited late one evening after her shift. Dr. Thompson, she whispered, I've been keeping a secret. In all my years of practice, I never fully embraced your purely materialistic approach. I've seen too many things that science alone couldn't explain. She showed me her patient files cases where she had documented both medical and spiritual aspects of healing. I always kept these separate records, she explained, afraid of being seen as unscientific. But your experience, it's giving others the courage to speak up. The turning point came when Dr. William Parker, head of neurology and a longtime critic of religious experiences, arrived at my room. He stood awkwardly at the foot of my bed, his usual confident demeanor replaced by uncertainty. Lisa, he said, using my first name for the first time in our 20-year acquaintance, I need to show you something. From his briefcase, he withdrew a series of brain scans, my brain scans. These were taken during your cardiac arrest, he explained, pointing to various areas of activity. We've never seen patterns like this before. The spiritual experience you described. There's something here we can't explain with our current understanding of neuroscience. Dr. Parker's admission opened a floodgate. Other medical professionals began sharing their own observations of inexplicable healings, profound spiritual experiences, and phenomena that stretched the boundaries of medical science. My hospital room became a kind of unofficial meeting ground where science and spirituality could coexist in open dialogue. The validation of my experience took an unexpected turn when Dr. Parker presented my case at the annual neuroscience conference. The medical community, initially skeptical, couldn't ignore the compelling evidence in my brain scans. The patterns of activity during my near-death experience defied conventional explanation, suggesting a state of consciousness beyond current scientific understanding. We must consider, Dr. Parker told the packed auditorium, that Dr. Thompson's experience represents something our current medical framework is inadequate to explain. His presentation included testimonies from the medical staff who had witnessed my cardiac arrest, including detailed accounts of information I had known about events occurring while I was clinically dead. Thomas attended the conference, his scientific worldview visibly shaken by the evidence. After the presentation, he came to my hospital room, his face showing the internal struggle between the rational surgeon and the husband who knew me better than anyone. "Lisa," he said, sitting beside my bed, "I'm sorry. I should have listened." With weeks of speech therapy allowing me better control, I managed to tell him both can be true science and faith. He took my hand, and for the first time since my experience, I saw understanding in his eyes. The wall between us began to crumble. James's return to my side was even more powerful. He brought his journal, now filled with new entries about his own spiritual journey. "Mom," he said, reading from its pages, "the day you had your heart attack when I was about to end things, I felt something. I thought I was imagining it, but after hearing about your experience, I know it was real. It was love, wasn't it? Not just yours, but something bigger." The hospital board reviewed my case, and in an unprecedented move, not only reinstated my medical license, but created a new department under my leadership, the Center for Spiritual and Psychological Integration. Despite my ongoing physical limitations, they recognized that my unique experience bridged a crucial gap in patient care. My story began to attract attention beyond the medical community. Religious leaders and scientists alike sought to understand how my experience could inform their understanding of consciousness, faith, and healing. I started receiving letters from around the world, doctors who had hidden their own spiritual experiences, patients who had felt unheard, researchers interested in exploring the intersection of science and spirituality. The most profound vindication came from my former patients. Many returned, not for treatment this time, but to share how their lives had flourished when their spiritual experiences were honored rather than dismissed. Sarah Collins led a support group for grieving parents, helping them navigate both the psychological and spiritual aspects of loss. Michael Robertson's ministry grew stronger, now incorporating a deeper understanding of mental health alongside spiritual guidance. As my body slowly healed and my speech improved, I found myself at the center of a movement I never could have imagined, one that sought to harmonize the scientific and spiritual aspects of human experience. The very credentials and reputation I had feared losing became tools for building bridges between these seemingly opposite worlds. A year after my near-death experience, I stood before a packed auditorium at the Harvard Medical School, the same hall where I had once lectured about the neurological basis of religious delusions. My right side was still weakened, and my speech, though improved, remained measured and deliberate. But these limitations had become my greatest teachers. Science and faith, I began, my voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, are not opposing forces, but different lenses through which we view the same profound reality. The audience, a mix of medical professionals, religious leaders, and former patients, listened with rapt attention as I shared my journey from skeptic to bridge builder. The Center for Spiritual and Psychological Integration had grown beyond my wildest expectations. We had developed a revolutionary approach to mental health treatment that honored both empirical evidence and spiritual experience. Our success rates in treating depression, anxiety, and trauma exceeded traditional approaches, drawing attention from medical institutions worldwide. Thomas sat in the front row, his hand clasped with James's. Our family had found a new harmony, stronger for having been broken and rebuilt. James had become a peer counselor at the center, using his own experience to help other young people struggling with spiritual questions in a material world. His journal entries had become the foundation for a youth program that helped teenagers integrate their spiritual experiences with mental health support. The most remarkable transformation wasn't in our methods or success rates, but in the lives touched by our work. Sarah Collins now directed our grief support program, helping others find healing through both therapeutic techniques and spiritual understanding. Michael Robertson collaborated with us regularly, bringing a renewed vigor to his ministry that balanced faith with psychological insight. Dr. Parker had become our strongest ally in the medical community. His ongoing research into the neurological patterns observed during my near-death experience had opened new avenues of study and consciousness research. "We're not explaining away the spiritual," he would say. "We're discovering how intricately it's woven into our very biology." My office in the center became a testament to integration. Medical textbooks shared shelf space with religious texts, brain scans hung alongside artistic representations of spiritual experiences. Each day brought new opportunities to witness the healing that occurred when people were given permission to embrace both their rational and spiritual natures. The morning's lecture concluded with a question that once would have sparked my skepticism. Dr. Thompson, do you still communicate with Jesus? The hall fell silent, waiting for my response. With my hard-won clarity of speech, I answered, every day, in ways both subtle and profound. Through the faces of our patients, through the mysteries we encounter in our research, through the quiet moments when science and spirit remind us that truth is bigger than our ability to explain it. The real miracle I've come to understand isn't just in the dramatic moments of divine intervention, but in the quiet daily transformation of hearts and minds. As I sit in my office at the center, watching the sunset paint the Boston skyline in shades of gold, I reflect on how far we've all come. My story has spread beyond what I could have imagined, touching lives in unexpected ways. Medical schools have begun incorporating spiritual awareness into their curriculum, not as an alternative to science, but as a complementary dimension of human experience. The wall between faith and reason that I helped build over my career is being dismantled brick by brick. James has grown into a remarkable young man, his own journey of faith and doubt becoming a beacon for others. He leads youth groups now, helping teenagers navigate the complex intersection of mental health and spirituality. Mom, he told me recently, remember when you used to say everything needed scientific proof? Now we're proving that love and faith are as real as anything under a microscope. Thomas and I have found a deeper connection through our shared experience of transformation. His surgical practice has evolved too. He now understands that healing involves more than just physical repair. We often work together, combining his medical expertise with my integrated approach to create comprehensive treatment plans that address both body and spirit. The journal I started in the hospital, written with my shaky left hand, has been published. Beyond Reason, a skeptic's journey to faith has become a bridge between communities that once viewed each other with suspicion. Medical conferences now include panels on spiritual experiences, while religious gatherings welcome discussions of psychological well-being. But perhaps the most profound change has been in how we approach human suffering. At the center, we no longer try to explain away people's deepest experiences or reduce them to chemical equations. Instead, we create space for mystery alongside medicine, for faith alongside fact. Jesus' words to me during my near-death experience have proven prophetic. Your greatest ministry will be born from your greatest skepticism. My previous dedication to pure rationality has given me the language to speak to other skeptics, while my experience has given me the wisdom to guide them toward a larger truth. As I finish writing this account, my right hand still paralyzed, but my heart fully alive, I understand that my story is not just about a journey from doubt to faith, or from science to spirituality. It's about the possibility of wholeness, of embracing all aspects of human experience without having to deny any part of it. To those who read this, whether you approach it as a scientist, a believer, or a seeker, I offer this truth: the light of understanding shines brightest when we remove the artificial boundaries between head and heart, between empirical observation and spiritual experience. There is room in this vast universe for both the precision of science and the mystery of faith. For as Jesus told me in that timeless moment between life and death, the truth shall set you free, and the truth I've discovered is bigger than any one perspective, deeper than any single approach to understanding. It embraces both the measurable and the mysterious, the rational and the revelatory, the physical and the divine. If this story of transformation from skepticism to faith has touched your heart or sparked your curiosity, I invite you to join our growing community of seekers and believers. Share your own experiences and thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the light someone else needs. Support our mission of bridging science and spirituality by subscribing to our channel and sharing this video with friends and family who might be wrestling with similar questions. Your engagement helps us reach more souls searching for understanding. Don't forget to like this video if you found value in Dr. Thompson's remarkable journey from doubt to divine truth.